Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. We're crossing the Atlantic again to talk about one of the most salient products of the Enlightenment. It is no coincidence that the American Revolution happens in the same year as the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And in so doing, we're also going to try to discuss history in sort of broader terms, looking at the processes of history and rather than simply recapping the events. Now, speaking of recaps, let's talk about the Enlightenment real quick, just so that we're all on the same page. We said that the scientific revolution is first and foremost a rediscovery of ancient knowledge and methods and their subsequent application in the observation of the natural world. And if you guys remember, predominantly we talked about logic as being sort of the main rediscovery here. Scientists of this period refer to themselves as natural philosophers because they believe themselves to be inheriting sort of this tradition that goes back to ancient Greece of observation and study of the natural world. But if the scientific revolution is the use of this knowledge to study the natural world, then its direct consequence, the Enlightenment, is the use of those same principles to study people and society. And this sort of creates new disciplines like political science, history, we studied analytically, and economics. And speaking of economics, we talked about Adam Smith as being sort of the example of Enlightenment economic thinking. And he's the father of modern economics, very critical of mercantilism and a strong believer in free trade. And we call this, by a broader brush, liberalism. And in Adam Smith's view, humans, especially in a state of nature, are naturally greedy, but not necessarily violent. So in order to get what we want, unlike what Hobbes thought, we're not going to fight each other. We're just going to trade with each other to get what we want. And this sort of greed is natural perspective that Adam Smith has leads him to formulate these two big hypotheses on economics: the division of labor and the invisible hand. The former being this idea that as humans we specialize in fields and things that we are good at, and that creates a higher standard of living and a more productive society. But again, we do so for the promise of future income, not because it's good for society. And this sort of principle is summarized better in the invisible hand, which says that when everyone follows their own self-interest, that's actually good for society because that leads to the optimal outcome in the political economy, as opposed to the government getting involved or people doing what they think may be good for society. We summarize this principle in our example. Remember what I said: bigger, better, faster, cheaper smartphones for everyone. When we looked at the smartphone market, that has largely held up. And that's sort of a textbook example of the free market at play. Now, of course, at the margins you can point to regulations, but by and large, the government really never got involved with the formation of the smartphone. And because it has developed so quickly, we can see the development of bigger, better, faster, cheaper smartphones for everyone right in front of us. I think very few people listening to this lecture do not own a smartphone. And I think that says a lot about how our society has progressed. Now, moving on, we're going to talk about the event that really starts two of the big revolutions of this period, the French and the American Revolution. And that event is the 7 Years' War. You may have also heard it called the French and Indian War here in the United States. And this war starts as sort of a minor squabble in Europe, but it ends up being very expensive. It's not a bloody war. This isn't 30 years war level carnage, but it is first and foremost very expensive. And it's expensive for two reasons. The first one being that it is the first war that pits old style kingdoms, feudal societies, versus new style states. And when these two interpretations of the world clash, that ends up being very expensive. And the second reason is that most every country in Europe now has colonies. If you want to be very technical about it, the 7 Years' War is in reality the First World War, because now that every European power has colonies, investments all over the world, and we've looked at what I mean when we say investments all over the world, this means that fighting doesn't just occur in Europe. It occurs in Africa, it occurs in Asia, and as we're going to see, it occurs in the United States. Now, because this war is so expensive, it has the outcome of bankrupting both major powers that fight in the 7 Years' War, namely England and France. Both countries exit this war bankrupt. Now we're going to see next time what that means for France. But for England, what do you do in a situation like this? Well, you need to raise taxes. You need to raise capital. And we've talked about how, in previous contexts, about how the American Revolution is really fought over taxes. But if you think about it, if you are England and you are still in this sort of proto-mercantilist ideology, well, of course you're going to raise taxes on the colonies. That's why you have them. They're your nest egg. Of course you're going to raise taxes on them. That's why you have colonies. But of course it's not seen this way in the Americas, because between the end of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, we begin to see Enlightenment politics in action. Now you'll notice in this slide that I have not referred to the American Revolution as a revolution. I've referred to it as a war of independence, because before we talk about revolutions, we need to define exactly what a revolution is. See, it's not... We don't want to just give terms without understanding what they mean. And in particular, I want to define what a revolution is versus what a reformation is. Now, if we're going to define them, revolutionary change is what I call here structural. It changes the political and economic structures of society. And the easiest way to determine that is to study which class is dominant at the time. Whereas reformations are more ideological. So if you think back to the Protestant Reformation, for example, you sort of have the same group of people in charge, right? The nobles were in charge before the Reformation, and they stayed in charge after the Reformation. But it causes a re-examination of the role of the church in political life in Europe. So it doesn't necessarily change class or power, but it changes how that power is perceived. And that's really the difference between revolution and reformation. Revolutions don't necessarily change who is in charge. Now, this is the model that I gave you regarding class in the 15th and 16th centuries, if you guys remember back to our first two lectures. Now, this is useful, but this isn't exactly applicable in the American context, because there were not many nobles in the Americas, and we didn't have peasants in the Americas. We had slaves in the Americas, because we were still following that plantation system that we introduced in Lecture 3. Now, which of these groups, in your mind, has power? Well, the answer is simple. It's the colonial governor, right? Colonial governors, this plantation class of individuals, are essentially the American equivalent of European nobility. Because if you think about what made the nobility, back to our class on feudalism, it was this idea that they owned lots of land that they did not necessarily work on, but they gained profit from the production on that land. Whereas the urban rich are more traders and highly skilled craftsmen, and we're going to look at these later on, but there is very little difference between the nobility and the plantation. In fact, I'm going to take this a step further. I would argue that the rural classes are dominant in pre-revolutionary America, with plantation owners replacing the nobility and a combination of yeoman farmers and slaves replacing the peasants. There were still poor farmers in the Americas. We called them yeomen, but by and large, in pre-revolutionary America, the plantation owners are dominant, and these form up what are the colonial governors? And we're going to call these landed elites. And this is the term that is used by Barrington Moore in referring to this rural wealthy class in colonial settings. Now, Barrington Moore is the author of one of the readings that you have to do for today. Now, Moore says that these landed elites have certain characteristics that you can define them by. They are always wealthy. They're almost always white, with some very rare occasions, especially in Latin America, where they may be mestizo, product of interracial relationships in Latin America. They own large amounts of land and slaves to work on that land, and they are almost always men. This class of individuals is dominant in pre-revolutionary America. But there's a problem here. Wealthy, white, landowning, slave-owning men is also fairly descriptive of our founding fathers. And see, this is the problem. This is sort of where we need to get into defining what a revolution is. See, the thing is that the founding fathers belong to that same social class as the colonial governors they were replacing. You know, people like Jefferson and Washington were wealthy, white, landowning, slave-owning men. You know, with few exceptions, namely Ben Franklin, most of the founding fathers belong to this social group. And so if we go back to our definition of what a revolution is and what revolutionary change is. You know, if you want to think of this as in more practical terms, think of society as a game. Reformations change the rules by which this game is played. A revolution changes the players, who gets to play. And that's really important. You know, if you look at the early draft of the Constitution, you can sort of see how this is not truly a structural change. The first draft of the Constitution, for example, limited voting to white men with property, aka our landed elites over here, because wealthy white men is who gets to vote. But this isn't the society we live in today. See, there is a revolution. You know, what Moore calls a path to the modern world, well, America does go through it. It's just not the American Revolution. There is an event. There is a revolution in America. We just call it the American Civil War. Now, we're going to get into why this may be, but for Moore at least, the true American Revolution is the Civil War. And here's what I mean. The North and the South, you know, were divided on the issue of slavery, but they were also divided economically. The Union was an urban, industrialized society, whereas the Confederacy was a rural and agricultural society. Now keep in mind, rural and agricultural means lots and lots of slaves, whereas the urban industrialized society did not have a great many of them. But when the North fights the South and the North wins, you see severe structural change because power moves out of the plantations and into the cities. In fact, if we look at this breakdown of class, what you're going to end up finding that the Civil War does is that it destroys the rural classes, no longer relevant in American society. And instead we're going to talk about the urban rich and the urban poor, or by their French names, proletariat versus bourgeoisie. And look, I can give you another case study here, just so that, just to prove my point. I challenge you, without Googling, don't open another tab while I say this, can you name a president between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt after the Civil War? Let's set aside Johnson because we all know him because he was impeached. Can you name another president? I think very few of you can. But you all know who Rockefeller is. And you all know who Carnegie is. And you all know who Stanford is. Because in this period of time after the Civil War, power shifts, power changes, and it moves from the Washington rural areas of society to the cities, to Chicago and to New York. Moves to the West Coast. And it has stayed like that, with some exceptions and with some change, of course. Societies are always in flux. But by and large, it broke rural power in America. Now, this is the only thing that Barrington Moore says. Barrington Moore talks about the road of revolution leading to democracy as only being one of three ways societies reach the modern world. The first one is the one we just saw, the democratic capitalist route, which combines Enlightenment economics from Adam Smith with modern conceptions of politics from our class on the nation state, in which you see the urban classes ally against the rural classes, in which the urban classes win. But there are other two routes as well. There's a fascist route to the modern world, in which the urban and the rural rich classes ally themselves against the perceived threat of a populist uprising, and they win. In which case, you get a system that has Enlightenment economics in it, but without modern politics. You get fascism out of that. And the last one, you see the rich versus the poor, but in this case, the poor win, the urban and the rural poor, and this is the communist route. You see this in China, and you see this in Russia. Now, you'll notice, logically speaking here, that there is one route that should be here and isn't, and that is urban versus rural with a rural victory. Simply put, we've never observed it. It hasn't happened yet. It's technically possible, but Moore doesn't discuss it, and while it logically may exist, we have yet to observe it. And this is sort of Barrington Moore. It's a very analytical, very broad view of history, very conceptual, but it will help you understand a lot of the processes that we're going to see moving forward. You know, when we talk about revolution, it's important to understand what these terms mean. And so, you know, Barrington Moore's conception of what a revolution is and how it works will be tremendously helpful in understanding the French Revolution. And his description of how the fascist and communist powers come to be will be tremendously important when understanding the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. I do want to make a final note on the other reading for today, and that's Jack Green's very brief paper. And he's another revolutionary critic, but he takes issue more with the terminology rather than sort of the concept of revolution. Because Jack Green views the American Revolution as something that brings change, but what he says is that revolutions are inherently internal, right? Revolutions are fought by societies against themselves, by groups within a society against other groups within a society. And their causes largely come from within. Dissatisfaction with the status quo, dissatisfaction with a ruling class or party or individual even. The causes of the American Revolution, however, are external. They all come from England. Therefore, it's very difficult to call it a revolution. And Jack Green says we should be calling it an American War of Independence. This is sort of another way of understanding, you know, why we view the American Revolution in this way. And this is these are two papers that I found very interesting and that should provide food for thought when we look at the American Revolution. So, that's going to wrap it up for this brief lecture. Finish up the readings, get into the discussion sections, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.